What's up, everyone? It is Raphael Garcia back for another edition of the Let's Talk Wrestling podcast. Today is November 14th, and I want to say thank you, everyone, for listening to our show. Be sure to like and share our content. You can catch me at rgarcia_sports on Twitter. And I can't remember what my Instagram name is, but you can follow MMA Ratings at MMAratings.net on Instagram and Twitter as well. Be sure to like and share and subscribe to our content. Every Thursday we do our mixed martial arts podcast with myself and Shawan Humes. On Wednesdays we're doing the Let's Talk Wrestling show, which is a new addition to our content here where we talk about the world of professional wrestling. And today we will be talking about a topic that kind of blends the two. We will be talking about the intersection between MMA and professional wrestling because we're seeing it so much more as of late. And I think with some of the things we saw happen this week and some of the things we've seen in the last few weeks, that maybe it's time for the conversation about how the two are so closely linked. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and hop into today's topic. We got a lot to talk about here. We're probably going to go about 40 minutes or so. So again, thank you for listening to our work here. Be sure to listen to it and share our content when you get the opportunity to, because we appreciate every bit of support that we get. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the conversation and talk about the link between pro wrestling and MMA. And the fact that we're seeing much more of a space where professional wrestling is beginning to embrace its distant sibling in mixed martial arts. I wanted to call it kissing cousins, but that's not quite right, because the two are linked, whether people want to believe it or not, agree with that idea or not. Mixed martial arts and professional wrestling are linked to one another. And in many stances, there's the conversation that professional wrestling is the birthplace of mixed martial arts, that MMA is actually the spawn of pro wrestling. And we're going to talk about that because that's kind of where you want to have that conversation if you talk about what was going on in Japan and how that kind of in the professional wrestling space there created the opportunity for mixed martial arts to grow and blossom into Pride and eventually what we saw become the UFC and lead us to where the MMA industry is today. So when I think about the conversation of pro wrestling and MMA and the link between the two, I always want to start with the idea of that everyone doesn't necessarily embrace the idea that they are closely linked. On one side of the conversation, you have MMA fans that don't want to watch professional wrestling. They think it's fake. It is, but they talk about it in a way that it's not entertaining. When in many regards, it's probably more entertaining as some of the bad quote-unquote fights that we see or fight cards that we see on television today. Professional wrestling is probably just as entertaining as those, if not more so. There's a very close correlation between the two. And you also have the idea of there's professional wrestling fans that just aren't interested in mixed martial arts for whatever reason. They don't think it's as intriguing. There's one individual actually who I used to listen to their content who used to speak about how MMA is missing the story aspect that does not draw him in. That he was interested in following Conor McGregor because he had that story aspect to it, but other than him and Ronda Rousey when she was fighting, there weren't any major stories that brought them in. Brock Lesnar did that for a little while, and we're going to speak about that link too. But Brock Lesnar did that for a little while, and unfortunately, it did not do enough to keep him kind of engrossed in MMA, even though he came over from the professional wrestling space. I myself am a converted professional wrestling fan. I'm a big fan of both, especially and you know that, especially if you follow me on social media. Hell, the fact I'm even doing this show will tell you that. But I accidentally stumbled into the world of MMA because of my link and interest in professional wrestling. And maybe another day I'll tell that story. I've told it plenty of times before. But there is a space, there is an opportunity for the two to leverage one another. And we see that going on within the WWE right now, as Ronda Rousey is probably well, in a mainstream stance, she's the organization's biggest star because as she's made the jump from mixed martial arts into the world of professional wrestling, she's definitely drawn a lot of eyeballs. And we're going to talk about what her insertion did from the business for the business side of WWE, especially in Q2 of this year. We're going to take a high level look at some of the numbers of when she had her first match back at WrestleMania 34 in April. But there's a business opportunity between the two, and I think that's worth a conversation as well. And what I like to talk about is there are a lot of people that have bounced back and forth between MMA and professional wrestling, a lot more than people probably even really recognize. On both sides of the conversation, there's a lot of well-known professional wrestlers that have fought in MMA. There's a lot of well-known mixed martial artists that have made the leap into professional wrestling. I just want to run down. I did a random Google search earlier today while I was working on the show agenda, looking up some names, and there's a bunch of names that kind of jumped off the page to me. These are, I think, about 10, 11 names that I just wanted to list off beyond Ronda and Brock that everyone knows about, of people who have done double duty, as what we'll call it, for. And that list includes names such as Ken Shamrock and Dan Severn. Everyone will probably recognize those. Kid Cash, I did not know he had an MMA career behind him. Quentin Jackson and Tito Ortiz, they definitely did a lot of work over in Impact when they were fighting for Bellator. Well, they both still are fighting for Bellator. Well, Quentin is, Tito is not. Bobby Lashley, we are well known, well aware of his MMA career as well. Yuji Nagata, a lot of people won't realize that the Japanese star, he's probably most well known to American fans for his time in WCW, but he's also still doing his thing in New Japan. He has a MMA record as well. CM Punk, you know what that is. Sonya Deville, she's part of the Riot Squad or Absolution, whatever. She's on SmackDown roster now. She has a 2-on-1 professional mixed martial arts career. Minoru Suzuki has, I think he's 30-20 in MMA, but he has quite the career as well. Katsuyori Shibata as well, who's also out on injury, because of his serious head injuries that he had last year. He has an MMA record. I mean, there's names such as Jack Gallagher, who's fought in MMA. Alberto Del Rio has a MMA record. He's actually returning to mixed martial arts within combat arenas. He actually combat Americans. He just announced that this maybe about last month or the month before that he plans on returning to the cage. He also fought as Mil Mascaras or Dos Mascaras over in Japan, and was head kick knocked out by Mirko Krokop. I'm thinking about 45, 46 seconds too. That was almost about 10 years ago. But yeah, there's definitely some correlation between the two in MMA and professional wrestling. I could continue going on down the line. I mean, you got Matt Riddle. You got so many names that have done both jobs that I think it's interesting to see that there isn't more of a correlation between the two. Tom Lawler, who is fought in UFC, he's fighting next weekend. He's actually a growing name over on MLW. So there's definitely a lot of bounce back and forth between the two. I want to say Brock is probably the biggest individual who's found success in both spaces. Josh Barnett has done it too, who's found a lot of success in both spaces. I mean, he's the current WWE Universal Champion, and many expect him to fight for the UFC heavyweight title at some point in time next year. He's a former UFC heavyweight champion as well. So it's definitely going to be some crossover there, and I think that it's not as easy as it looks, but B, I think that as names get larger in the mixed martial arts space, there may be some opportunity for some individuals to make that leap back and forth. Sorry for the pause there. I do not like to drink on air, but as always, I try to pause my mic right when I try to take a sip. Gotta keep my voice working right now. But mixed martial arts today is a massive, massive industry. I don't think it's as large as professional wrestling, but it is one in which its largest promotion, the UFC, was recently sold for $400 million back in 2016. This is one of the largest deals in sports history. And it's growing to a point where, I mean, Conor McGregor has kind of taken jabs, and him and Roman Reigns have gone back and forth on social media about the idea of Conor making the leap over to professional wrestling. And if he ever wanted to do that, he could. I mean, we've already seen him jump into the boxing space and make millions of dollars and get millions of people around the world intrigued in his actions. You could easily see him stepping into the professional wrestling space and doing something over there. People would stop and watch. So there is a space for that. We're seeing it right now with Ronda Rousey. Ronda is probably tied into one of the biggest stories in professional wrestling that we have not seen for quite a while, and it involves her and Becky Lynch. They were supposed to be having what was a highly anticipated match this Sunday for Survivor Series. Unfortunately, Becky Lynch had her face smashed in by Nia Jax on Monday, where her nose is broken and she had a concussion, and now she's off of that card. And Rousey will now be facing Charlotte, which is something that we'll cover later, because this match creates another opportunity for real life and professional wrestling to continue to blur the lines between the two. So we'll chat about that briefly. But usually what we see is we see professional wrestling brands and promotions looking to capture mixed martial artists that are at the end of their career, or they're at a career crossroads where they can make the transition between the two. I'll use names like Tom Lawler and Matt Riddle, for example. Lawler was not doing so well in the mixed martial arts space. He was fighting in the UFC, but he wasn't moving anywhere within becoming a champion, becoming a big star. He obviously wasn't making as much money as he once was due to some of the changing aspects of how the UFC was doing business. Then he ran into USADA and was hit with a USADA violation, which forced him out of action for an extended period of time. Now, during that time, he was already making the transition over to professional wrestling, but he's become more of a name within Major League Wrestling, which is also known as MLW, which is where he does most of his work. He's involved in some pretty integral storylines there. But now that his suspension is up, he's actually fighting on next weekend's card that is headlined by Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz, 3 or 4, whatever the hell fight number it is. I don't care. I'm not too interested. But Tom Lawler is fighting on that card, so it'll be interesting to see if he continues to try to bounce back between the two to, do the best he can as a sports entertainer and as an athlete. I mean, he is a prize fighter. He's trying to earn the most amount of money he can throughout his career. And that brings me over to Matt Riddle. We're all very familiar with Matt Riddle, and you're probably more familiar with him as a professional wrestler than he is as a mixed martial artist. But he had time in The Ultimate Fighter. He spent time on that show. He also, I thought I had my phone on silent. But he fought in Bellator. He fought on pretty much important organizations, and now he is one of the hottest signees on the WWE network, or the WWE space. And he was recently signed to the WWE a couple months back. He's made his NXT debut, and he's already over. I mean, he was over before he stepped foot in the Performance Center. They know they have a big star there. He's actually competing this Saturday against Cassius Ohno in NXT TakeOver, but it's just a matter of time before Matt Riddle's on the main roster doing the damn thing there. I mean, in some regards, he could have gone straight to the main roster, but Bro is over. This is going to be a pretty interesting ride for him. But he was someone that was in a career transition. He was cut from the UFC for excessive violations with weed. He fought over in Bellator. He didn't do so great. And it's kind of like, well, what's next? And he started professional wrestling. And what was so funny about that is if you go back through the annals of Dana White audio clippings, as always, he has something to say about someone that ends up biting him in the ass afterwards, because he joked that Matt Riddle would not be a star in professional wrestling and he wouldn't make any money there. Now he's probably a bigger star than he could have ever been in mixed martial arts. So you see, as I said, if guys and women can translate correctly, there's an opportunity there. There's an opportunity for them to be bigger stars than they could have ever been if they leave mixed martial arts and come over to professional wrestling. On the other side, on the flip side of that, I think it's much more difficult for someone to go from professional wrestling into mixed martial arts. I don't care what you say about Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar had a pedigree of amateur wrestling that is not found too often. I mean, you do not ignore the fact that he was an NCAA champion and he competed at the highest levels there. So he came in with a skill set that already gave him an advantage over some of the other men that he was fighting. So he is not an adequate example there. But then you have someone like CM Punk, who has fought twice in the UFC now, getting basically bludgeoned both times. In my opinion, that's probably what it would look more like if you saw more professional wrestlers try to make that jump. I mean, Kurt Angle tried to do it. Well, he was talking of doing it at one time, but his body has kind of failed him since. But if you look back to what he was doing as an Olympic wrestler, he could have made the leap. Steve Williams, Dr. Death, he tried his hand at MMA. He got knocked out. Jack Gallagher actually did pretty well. But let me think who else. We have already talked about Alberto Del Rio. He actually has a winning record in MMA. You have guys like Dan Severn. Dan Severn's an MMA legend, but he also had a lot of success over in professional wrestling. Ken Shamrock as well, legend in MMA, also a multiple time. He held many WWE titles throughout his career as well, too. So you do see some crossover between the two, where there are men and women who do well in professional wrestling and mixed martial arts, but that's more of an exception than par for the course. But that does not stop the conversation from coming up, because mixed martial artists recognize now that they got to do all they can to grab headlines. So when someone like a Chris Cyborg mentions going into professional wrestling, best believe that the names are going to speak up. Or if you see a professional wrestler make jokes about MMA, best believe someone's going to speak up, just for the opportunity to create enough buzz that, hey, maybe I can get a payday out of this. So there is these individuals are getting a bigger business and to understand that, hey, there's an opportunity for us to work together and everybody gets paid in the end, or they get some marginally paid at some point in the end, because that's another conversation for another day. But as we talk about everyone getting paid, let's talk about Rousey's impact and what she's done for the WWE since moving over from the UFC there. So her first match was back at WrestleMania 34, which was in early April of this year. Actually, it was so important that Luke Thomas and I appeared on his live taping of us watching WrestleMania, and this guy hates professional wrestling. But we sat down and we all watched it together and did like a live reaction show, which you can find on his channel from earlier this year. But she's done big business for the WWE, and we're going to go over some of those numbers. But from a business standpoint, so WrestleMania 34 grossed a record $14 million as an event, sold out crowd of 78,000. Q2 revenue increased 31%, which is some of it is being attributed to her presence in some of the deals, like the Saudi Arabia deal that was kind of announced during that time too as well. WWE Network subscribers increased 10% to 1.8 million. And you think about that, that's $10 each person. So what is that, 10 million? Uh, Q2 numbers were overall very strong, some of their highest numbers that they've seen in the history of the organization. So you see that she's drawing star power that if your name's not Brock Lesnar or Conor McGregor, you're probably not going to get within the MMA and professional wrestling spaces. So she's doing. I mean, she's from a business standpoint, she's doing great things for the WWE. You may not be such a fan of her in-ring action or her promos. That's another conversation for another day. But she is definitely someone that draws eyeballs to the product, and someone who is a name that fans will stop and see whenever they read about or hear her name mentioned in the news. Brock Lesnar is also someone who could be considered a star. He's been a star for both brands. So much so that he's given like the epitome of special treatment within the WWE. We just saw Roman Reigns get forced out of action due to his issues with leukemia, and what did the WWE do? Instead of trusting their younger talent and maybe putting the title on someone like a Braun Strowman or a Seth Rollins or someone like that and seeing if they could do units, move business for the organization, they put it right back on right back on Brock, with the hopes that he will draw attention and keep eyeballs there, and much to the chagrin and malaise of like fans who watch professional wrestling, and the moans and groans there. Brock Lesnar is now the WWE Universal Champion, just for the simple fact that they know that he's going to garner some type of reaction, some type of uh, attention grabbing star power. What's the word I'm looking for? He has the ability to garner attraction that some of the other names on the roster would not have get. So they put the title back on him, and he leveraged that opportunity to sign a new deal with the organization that's going to bring him in a lot of money and hopefully translate to additional views for the WWE. But at the same time, the UFC benefits from this because he's one of the few individuals on their roster that can headline a card or be included in a card and push it over 1 million buys. I mean, there's him, Conor McGregor, and Ronda Rousey. Those are the three individuals that have consistently pushed fights over 1 million buys. GSP never did that on his own. So we'll see if the situation is leveraged into him getting that Daniel Cormier fight or the John Jones fight, both of which would easily do 1 million buys for the UFC. But with so much of a correlation from a business standpoint between the two industries, one must wonder why there isn't more of a storyline standpoint between the two, because there's a space for that as well. And we're going to talk about that now. So what we are going to do is talk about some of the storyline aspects between WWE and professional wrestling and mixed martial arts. Perhaps the biggest one is going on right now with Rousey and Lynch. So for those who aren't following, Ronda Rousey is a WWE Women's Champion. She is PWI, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, which is kind of like the Sports Illustrated of professional wrestling, but it stays in character per se. Voted Ronda Rousey the #1 women's professional wrestler in the world, even though she's only had about 12 matches or so. And a lot of people kind of were up in arms about that. Like, how is she so inexperienced and already considered the best women's wrestler in the world when women like Becky Lynch have been doing this for years? And Becky Lynch has had an interesting year, and she just won the SmackDown Women's title, but she's done so in a way that a lot of people are comparing her organic rise to prominence now, and they're comparing it to Steve Austin, but it's very different in such a way because Steve Austin was still tabbed as someone who would be a star. Becky Lynch wasn't really given that opportunity. She kind of took it for herself, and it grew in a way where the fans just got behind her, got behind her, got behind her to the point where WWE couldn't ignore it, even though they tried to quell it multiple times. They tried to change it multiple times. They tried to put their own spin on things. It just would not work. The fans wanted her presented in a way that they wanted her presented, and it's finally got to that point. Um, this match with Rousey and Lynch was easily could have been the headliner for Survivor Series. It's bigger than anything else on the card. Lynch is bigger than any male athlete on the card. She's the biggest star in professional wrestling in the WWE right now. Ronda Rousey may be the biggest mainstream star, but Becky Lynch is the guy for lack of a better term. And their match was supposed to happen on Sunday. Now, unfortunately, she was hit in the face on Raw on Monday, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of the pictures that have been going on. I've been sharing them where her face was a bloody mess, her nose was broken. On Tuesday, she returned to SmackDown where half of her face was still black from the bruising, and she still was suffering from issues with the concussion. So you really don't know what type of mental shape she was in, but I mean, she was still ready to tough it out. She's still delivering the best promos in the industry today, but she's facing Rousey. Everyone expected her to lose this match just because Rousey is the darling that the WWE is trying to push to the forefront for whatever reason, regardless of how fans are reacting to that push and pushing back against the idea that she should be the face of women's wrestling today. But what has made this storyline so intriguing is that there was a space for Lynch to begin attacking Rousey for her behavior in mixed martial arts. So anyone that followed Rousey throughout her MMA career is that she wasn't always the heroine that she's made out to be. She's done some questionable things. She said some questionable things. She's behaved in some questionable ways that really kind of changed the light on her. That season of Ultimate Fighter where she was on, it really caused a lot of people to kind of question who she really was. And even though MMA fans will know that, WWE is trying to push her as a smiling baby face that people have been slowly rejecting the idea of. If you go back to a few weeks back with WWE Evolution, where she was in the main event against Nikki Bella, her promos there against Nikki basically shaming her for dating John Cena, shaming Brie Bella for marrying Daniel Bryan, rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Calling them Do Nothing Bellas insinuated that they slept their way to the top, when in fact that they're both very well versed entrepreneurs who have built their businesses and built their brains around themselves in a way that other professional wrestlers have not. It was very uncomfortable to listen to Ronda's promos and like what she was saying, and that has kind of continued with the way she's tried to shame Becky Lynch in doing everything she's needed to do, from being a flight attendant to being a member of a clown troupe to doing all that work just to get into professional wrestling. Ronda's been kind of berating her for that, when in reality, Becky's been into professional wrestling from day one. This isn't just some dream fly of the night career for her. But things got pretty interesting today when Lynch has been killing Rousey on Instagram, coming for Travis Brown, or excuse me, on social media. She's been coming for Travis Brown, coming for everything that Rousey basically has stood for. But she took an interesting step today when she brought up Ronda Rousey's loss to Holly Holm. And this is something that I've been waiting for a WWE creative to do. And I almost got to a point where I didn't think that they would actually do it. But she brought up Holly Holm and the way Rousey reacted to that, we all saw the pictures of her running off the train or off the plane with her face covered in the pillow, talking on Ellen about wanting to commit suicide after she lost, needing to have a baby to give herself a reason to live. We remember all of that. And what we see now is that I know, I mean, everyone who knows MMA and professional wrestling knows that there's no way that this didn't get okayed by Rousey before it went out. But the fact that they're willing to touch upon that space was perfect. The WWE was just actually back in Australia, and they didn't touch the idea that this was the place where Home knocked Rousey out. But instead, they bring it up during this storyline here because they know that the storyline is getting more and more red hot, and they need to keep it that way until Lynch returns and we can finally get this match. Hopefully, we get it at Royal Rumble or WrestleMania or something like that. But there is an opportunity for this to be huge, and now that they're segueing into the realm of real life, it makes it much more intriguing to see what comes next. On Sunday, Charlotte is replacing Becky and facing off against Rousey, and this is a match that everybody thought would be the headliner for an upcoming WrestleMania, but instead of getting it now, it should still be a great one. But again, it creates an opportunity for us to see some more transitions between real life and MMA and professional wrestling. And I mean that because we should not be surprised if we see any chicanery that involves Shayna Baszler, Jessamyn Duke, and Marina Shafir, who are all a part of the NXT brand, where Shayna Baszler is the WWE Women's NXT Champion, or what is it? Whatever. She holds the women's title in NXT. Duke and Shafir have just joined her as a part of that roster there, and they're causing havoc there. Do not be surprised if we see a situation where all four of those women are involved with an angle against Lynch, Charlotte, Sasha Banks, and Bayley. That's really kind of where the start of this occurred, where Rousey was making the move from professional wrestling or from MMA into professional wrestling, which led to Baszler getting signed by NXT. Now, Shayna Baszler is the truth. She was someone who had value as a professional wrestler long ago, but she is, she's moving her way up the ranks through NXT, and she's probably bound to the main roster sooner rather than later. Shafir and Duke, they are being fast-tracked, but they could easily be pit in this 4-on-4 against Charlotte, Lynch, Banks, and Bayley, and I think that's something that's going to do gangbusters, especially if the WWE gets it right with how it's booked and how they leverage the available stories that are there. Hell, we can even see a situation where Baszler ends up wrestling against Rousey just because of the idea of Baszler's been she was the pioneer in women's MMA. She's the reason why Rousey kind of became a bigger wrestling fan. And to think that she's always had to play second fiddle to Ronda Rousey, there's a space there where they can tell that story. They can tell so many different stories. Like Shafir, Marina Shafir is married to Roddy Strong, who's a part of NXT and as the Undisputed. So there's so many different storylines that can be told within that group alone that will make this an intriguing time, because we see that there's a space for storylines in MMA and professional wrestling to blend together, and they don't have to be kept so far apart as if the promotions don't know about each other, or they don't know that this person has fought and also done professional wrestling as well. There's an opportunity here for us to be talking about this in a way that can lead to fans growing across both spaces, and let's hope that that's something that we see in the future, because it brings together two sports or two industries that I'm highly interested in. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that embrace between the two, because like I said, there is a space there. Professional wrestling and mixed martial arts are strange bedfellows, for lack of a better term. Do I think that we will ever see them partner together? I do. I do think that there's a space between the two, that they can work together and also stay far enough apart that they can do their own things at the same time. I think that there's a space for that, and I hope that that's something that we see in the near future. But with that in mind, I want to say thank you for listening to our content. You can like and share in our Let's Talk Wrestling podcast, share it across your social media channels, and also subscribe where you can catch us talking about this show every Wednesday, doing our MMA ratings podcast every Thursday. And also go to MMAratings.net where you can tell us what you think about all the MMA fights going on around the world, using the star system to rate how good the fights, individual fights, and fight cards were. And you can also find written content by myself, Shawan Humes, Michael Ford, and everybody on the scene there. So please be sure to like and share our content, and come back next week to hear what we got to talk about. And again, thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday evening, everyone. Have a great night.